It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Helen Andrews, and we're going to be discussing her brand new book, Boomers, the Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster. Helen, it is truly an honor. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Well, Helen, I know you're going to be brand new to a lot of the folks in my audience, so let's kick this off by having you share a bit of the Helen Andrews origin story for somebody meeting you the first time in our talk today. What do they need to know about you?
I am a senior editor at The American Conservative. So you can find me and a lot of other great writers at theamericanconservative.com. This is my first book for Sentinel, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House, where some of my publishing house label mates are Rod Dreher and Gracie Olmstead.
And in terms of the journey with this book, I'm always curious, what was it like to move from more article-based writing to something in a full book? That's a bit of a leap. It's a different kind of project.
And I don't think I would have been able to do it if I hadn't gotten valuable encouragement from Bria Sanford at Penguin, and mainly from a magazine editor that I work with very frequently, and that's Rusty Reno at First Things. He was definitely gave me the jolt of encouragement I needed to graduate from magazines to books.
And as a publishing guy, I'm always curious how a book gets its start. So in terms of boomers, was this a topic you were passionate about, or was it that your friend you just mentioned encouraged you to keep moving in the direction with this project?
Well, I'm a millennial, born in 1986, and as everybody knows, millennials and boomers are natural enemies. And I had kind of an inchoate sense that my generation had been badly served by our predecessors, that there were some things that we were supposed to inherit from them as a society that just didn't get handed on. But I didn't have an idea to make a book out of that until Rusty Reno reminded me of one of my favorite books, which is Eminent Victorians, which was published in 1918. It's a century-old book, but it's by a fellow named Lytton Strachey, who decided to do a takedown of the Victorian generation. He thought they were stuffy and backward and moralistic, and he wanted to just give them both barrels. And his book did that. It was a really effective demolition job. So I don't really agree with a lot of Strachey's case against the Victorians, the substance of it, but the format, I thought he really proved that that kind of a book can work. I tried to be a little bit fairer than Strachey was when I dealt with the boomers relative to how he dealt with the Victorians. But I thought that looking at a generation in the format of six individuals and biographies, that was a really good way to go and do a substantive critique.
And you obviously profile six prominent boomers in the book. In terms of your process of elimination, how did you decide who would actually make the cut?
Well, I started off, once I had brainstormed a list of boomers who represented something about their generation, by crossing off everybody that I hated. Because I decided that, in some ways, I didn't want to write about anybody for whom I felt contempt, because I thought that's just not an interesting story. I want to look at people who genuinely have the elements of greatness, who could have done so much good for the world, and who in many ways did change the world because of their virtues and their good qualities. And that it's therefore tragic that through sheer boomerness, their ultimate effect should be on net so destructive and negative.
Well, in a moment, I want to get into some of the specific individuals that you profile in the book, but in terms of kind of painting that broad brush of the boomerness, if you will, which you just used that word. Um, if you had to kind of top three good, top three bad, like what are the contributions to society? I guess I often might think of it as, there's like the public persona, the urban legend, the exciting thing, and then there's sort of the behind the scenes look. What are the contributions of the boomers that we should really be aware of?
The boomers would like for their record to be evaluated on the basis of the 1960s. The boomers really think that was their shining moment, their great contribution to American society, when they brought a certain idealism to politics that hadn't been there before, a youthfulness. They certainly did that. They certainly changed the world in the 1960s, but that's not the whole story. If you want to evaluate the boomers as a generation, You also have to look at the era when they were actually in charge, in their 40s and 50s, in the highest positions of power. People like Bill Clinton is in a lot of ways, I think, the quintessential boomer. And he's somebody who took the flavor of the 1960s and applied it in the 1990s, which is in some ways very unattractive because, well, it makes the boomers the generation that sold out but would never admit that they sold out. They were the establishment but kept thinking of themselves as the rebels. And that hypocrisy is the essence of the boomerness that I try and explore.
Well, I think that's one of the interesting ongoing challenges in our days. We still see boomers in very prominent positions of power and leadership throughout society. Um, you have this public persona that you want to show. And I think back in the day, it was a lot easier to just be like, yeah, this is how I am. You're not going to see what I'm doing over here or over here. And now with the internet and sharing of information, and everybody's got a camera everywhere they go, it's really hard to hide the reality of what you're doing. So I feel like one of the challenges that generation faces is it's a lot easier, it's a lot more difficult to hide your true self versus 15, 20 years ago really wasn't too difficult, especially if you control the communications channels that were talking about you.
But in some ways, that's poetic justice for the boomers because they were the ones who tore down the very concept of propriety. The boomers were all about authenticity and let it all hang out. And they said there should not be any disparity between the public persona that you present and your true authentic self. You should never, ever, ever try and polish yourself up for public presentation. Now, me personally, I disagree with that. I think if you're going to present yourself to the public, you should maybe get a handle on some of your rougher edges. I think that's probably wise. I think that's probably considerate. But it was the boomers who said, no, that's a bad thing. That's inauthentic. So the fact that they're now the victims of this intrusive public glare, well, maybe they don't deserve any better.
Well, yeah, I always tell people be careful what you ask for because you just might actually get it, maybe in a way that you weren't expecting it or wanting it. Well, let's transition now into a few of the individuals that you cover in the book. One who is extremely iconic is Steve Jobs. Early on in my career, I spent over a decade in software and tech up in Minneapolis. So we all look to Steve Jobs as kind of our messiah, the guy who did all the cool things we wanted to do as geeks in software companies. So for Steve, I feel like, and especially since he's passed on, you then have like the legend and everything else that just gets added on to somebody after they pass away. But for Steve, like what good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, he's somebody who clearly changed society with many of his devices. At this point, I would say not necessarily for the better long term. But what were some of the contributions that we need to be mindful of, Steve? That good, bad, and in between.
I started off choosing Steve Jobs not because I wanted to attack him, but because I wanted to defend him against a charge that a lot of people lob against him. A lot of people say that Steve Jobs's whole hippie guru persona was just an act. That was fake, and underneath he was nothing but a corporate shark. Or even some people say he was a fraud. Not actually that cool or innovative. And I wanted to rebut that completely. He was absolutely, and he lived up to the hype. I think he truly was a genius. And I also think that his, pilgrimage to India and his John Lennon and Bob Dylan worship actually shaped the way that he ran his business. Now, if you have a background in IT, you will probably remember what the computer industry was like before Steve Jobs came along. It was the era of IBM. Computers were not if you had a computer in your office, it would be, supervised by some IT technicians,
That's
and you
right.
would ask them permission for time on the computer, or you would ask them to fulfill some task for you. And Steve Jobs said, no, I want to democratize technology. I want to have a computer in everybody's lap, and I want it to be so easy to use that you don't have to take 3 weeks of introductory classes the way you do if you want to use an IBM computer. I want it to be intuitive. And he accomplished that, which is a great success story of American business. He truly is one of the legends. The problem is that, like a good baby boomer, Steve Jobs imagined that the result of this democratization of technology would be unleashing human creativity, that everybody's inner genius would finally find expression. But if you're a millennial, that's not what ubiquitous technology looks like to you. It looks like an Uberized economy where you have an unstable job rather than a nice stable employee relationship like your parents enjoy. It looks like ubiquitous pornography. It looks like video game addiction. It looks like everybody being glued to a screen all the time. The addictive quality of technology was not something that Steve Jobs foresaw. And the fact that it did work out that way, I think, yeah, means that for millennials, you feel victimized by a country where there's a computer in everybody's pocket the way Steve Jobs envisioned.
Well, let's transition now to Aaron Sorkin. You know, funny enough, I remember having a conversation with my sister-in-law, or maybe my wife had the conversation actually. But they thought they should be more involved in politics and be aware of the election. So they were going to watch The West Wing to understand how politics worked. And I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm like, I don't know if watching a TV show is really the best idea to try to understand how our political system works. But so talk to us about Aaron Sorkin and kind of his contribution. I feel like it really ties to the ability of media, and as a guy who works in publishing and podcasting, all these different things, I understand the power of media to influence a perception. But we're in a day and age where we're rewriting history with media right now, which is pretty crazy. Or we ask TV to give us a lens to understand the world by. It's definitely a strange time.
Yeah, Sean, the joke's on you because your sister-in-law was absolutely right. Not only are people at home watching The West Wing to figure out politics, people who work in Washington, D.C., people who have jobs in the White House are
That's just
figuring
crazy to
out
me.
how to think. Armando Iannucci is the TV scriptwriter who's the creator of Veep, the TV show on HBO. And when he was doing research for that show, he was shown around the Obama White House by some people who worked there, just so he could get a feel for what it's like to work in the West Wing. And he reports being staggered to discover that these people who have jobs in the Obama White House on his tour were pointing out things in reference to the West Wing. They were saying things like, oh, that's where Josh would sit and that's where Donna would sit. And Iannucci was thinking, no, that's where you sit. You are a real person. Josh and Donna are fake. I'm born at exactly the right age to have watched The West Wing in high school, which means that people my age that I went to college with are also exactly the right age to have watched The West Wing when they were young and then decided that they wanted to go into politics. So I have, over the last 10 years since I graduated from college, seen these people that I went to school with kind of climb the ladder at the Department of Justice and the Democratic Party and are now in actual positions of influence in Washington. And I know that they are there because they were West Wing obsessives and that in their day-to-day lives, they're still imagining themselves as little characters in their own little West Wing episodes. And I don't think Aaron Sorkin is to blame for that. To his credit, in all of the interviews he's ever given, he said, I never meant to entice people into politics. I'm not that political. My college major was musical theater, which it was. But whether he intended it or not, he has had more of an effect on the way politics is conducted in Washington in the last 10 years than just about anybody else, which is terrifying.
Well, and, to his credit, I guess you could say he inspired a generation, certainly. But I think it just shows a shift in society where historically we might want to be like somebody we read about in history or somebody that inspired us in a book, or we're just finding our inspiration in different places. It's just a strange time where I want to be like fictional characters that I watched on TV or in a movie more so than trying to be like somebody who actually lived in history. It's a weird thing to aspire to aspire to be like a fictional character.
The thing that made me kind of feel for Aaron Sorkin more than anything else was the show that he made right after The West Wing. After he left The West Wing, Aaron Sorkin was the hottest scriptwriter in Hollywood. And the TV show that he decided to make as his triumphant follow-up was one called Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip. And it was a total commercial and critical failure. And the knock against the show was that it was a behind the scenes drama about an SNL type sketch comedy show. And all of the critics got so mad at Aaron Sorkin because they said, Aaron, you're writing West Wing monologues for these characters who work on SNL. Lighten up. It's just late night comedy, you know? It is inappropriate to have your characters speaking in such a grandiose manner. And the reason why that frustrated me so much is that I believe, and Aaron Sorkin believes, that the decisions made by TV executives and the people who produce entertainment in Hollywood mean more to more people than the decisions made by the people who work at the White House. People who work in Hollywood have more influence. And so their moral dilemmas absolutely matter just as much as the moral dilemmas that he depicted in The West Wing. So I couldn't stand it to see people saying, lighten up, it's just TV, especially since nothing proved the immense power of TV's influence more than The West Wing. So if anybody should know. So that was just a beautiful, poignant tragedy that and of course they canceled Studio 60 after one season, which was too bad because it was a pretty good show with a good cast. So yeah, poor Aaron Sorkin, in many ways a tragic genius.
Well, let's touch on one last person that you profile in the book, and that is Al Sharpton. One of the things I find fascinating about Al Sharpton is depending on which generation you're in, whether you're a boomer or an X or a millennial, we all have varying ideas of who Al Sharpton is because he's been a lot of things at a lot of different, well, through the decades, if you will. And so, in terms of Al Sharpton, how is he kind of representative of that boomer generation in his own special way?
Yeah, I think a lot of people whose idea of the civil rights movement is shaped by the heroic era of the 1960s and Dr. King see Al Sharpton as a bit of a falling off from that great generation. Does not quite live up to their standards. That's certainly how I thought about Al Sharpton, that he was more radical and more extreme, and also a lot less scrupulous than the great heroic era civil rights leaders. So I was interested and a little bit surprised to discover that the generation of civil rights leaders that have succeeded Al Sharpton, the people a generation younger than he is, see Sharpton as an old fuddy duddy. I have some quotes in the book that are very amusing from leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement who think that Al Sharpton tries to exercise too much control and he's too buttoned up and he's not in the streets with the people the way they are. So I guess your perspective on Al Sharpton all depends on how you look at it. But the one thing that Al Sharpton has always had going for him is that he genuinely has a following. Even in the 1980s when he was, perpetuating the Tawana Brawley hoax and kind of at his worst, even his worst enemies admitted that Al Sharpton is the kind of leader where if he has a rally, 5,000 people will show up. He's got a genuine Democratic following. When he ran for mayor of New York City, he got tens of thousands of votes, nearly won the Democratic nomination. That was proof that he had a real Democratic following among voters. Whereas today, when DeRay McKesson of the Black Lives Matter movement ran for mayor of Baltimore, he got 3% of the vote. So, Al Sharpton, compared to the great civil rights leaders of the 60s, does not measure up. Compared to the Black Lives Matter movement that exists today, I think he might be a lot better than them because he's got a real Democratic following, whereas theirs is just an epiphenomenon of social media.
Well, let's begin to wrap up here. But the one place I want to have us go yet is, for the Xers and the millennials. We are the children of boomers. So in terms of, let's say we read your book, we wrestle with it. Like, what do we do? What are our next steps? So we understand some of these challenges we're facing in society. We're at this unique time where there's sort of still four generations in the workplace. Is there a path forward? Is there a way to make some shifts that are going to bring some positive momentum, some positive direction?
There is a path forward, but it's difficult. The way I see it, the tragedy of the millennial generation is that nobody knows better than us that we need to make better decisions than the boomers did, right? We are well placed to see all of their mistakes and how bad some of their choices were. So we know better than anybody that we need to make better choices for ourselves. The problem is that a lot of the damage the boomers did was to destroy institutions, which means that some of the good choices that millennials feel that we need to make are no longer available to us. For example, boomers kind of threw off religion. They decided religion was not so important to them. We don't need to have active churches. And a lot of millennials now, especially now that we're getting older and having kids of our own, have decided that's terrible. We need religion. We as a country need to get back to that. But as you go to your local Episcopalian church, or down the block, when you get there, it's not the same church that existed before the boomers got to it. It is in many ways a weaker church. It's a different church. It's a more liberal church. And so it may not have there some of the things that you're looking for. So the task facing millennials and Gen Xers is not just to make better choices than the boomers did. We need to repair the institutions that the boomers took over and then damaged so that they are in better shape when we're in a position to pass them on to our kids.
That is a tall order to keep maintaining organizations and movements so they can keep existing and moving forward while also helping to change and repair them at the same time. That's like a multi-decade journey, I think, to get to what you're describing, but not impossible. I think we are reaching a time where there will be an inevitable kind of handing off of batons just as people get older and age out and have to retire. I think we've seen a lot of boomers having the perspective of you will take what I created from my cold dead hands, really, a lot of the time. And so, just by the natural progression of time, I think we will be forced into being able to make some of those shifts. But I don't know that it's necessarily going to be pretty in the near term as we move in that direction. For those of you listening, watching, Boomers is a fascinating book. I had to like wrestle with my wife to get my copy because she enjoyed it. Her mom, her sister, they're all lined up to read the book after she was done with it. So at least in our family, we've been excited about this book. Helen, for the listeners, the viewers who'd like to connect with you, find out more about your writing, find out more about your book, where are some of the places we can discover you on the web?
I'm on social media on Twitter at HER Andrews. My website is herandrews.com, and you can find me and a lot of other writers at theamericanconservative.com, where I am a senior editor.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Helen and pick up your very own copy of her new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Helen Andrews. Once again, our book today was Boomers, the Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster. If you'd like to connect with Helen and find out more, head on over to her website. That's at herandrews.com. And Helen, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks so much, Sean. This was a lot of fun.